The announcement came through every screen at once, the way only government directives do. An image of the national crest, then the calm voice of the minister reading out a decree that made no sense at first and made even less sense the longer I listened. "Effective immediately," she said in a tone that felt far too soft for something so world-altering. "All citizens identifying as male will adhere to the new uniform integration requirement. This includes daily wear of standardized compression hosiery for the purpose of public unity, health, and psychological alignment." Pantyhose. She meant pantyhose. I remember blinking at the screen, half convinced it was satire, half convinced the world had tilted in some way I couldn't see. My reflection on the blackened television, after the broadcast cut out abruptly, looked just as confused as I felt. A man in a rumpled shirt, hands still stained from a morning spent repairing a faulty pump at the water plant. Someone practical, grounded, ordinary. Someone who had no place in this strange order being imposed from above. I told myself it wouldn't stick. No one would take it seriously. But the next morning the checkpoints went up, officers stationed on street corners politely insisting on compliance. Standard issue hosiery, they called it, handing out slim beige packages with all the normalcy of passing out pamphlets. The pair they gave me felt impossibly light in my hand, like something that belonged to someone else. I tucked it under my arm and walked home with a strange feeling that the ground beneath me had become unfamiliar. That night, I left the packet unopened on my kitchen table. I circled it once like it was a living thing. I told myself I would deal with it in the morning. Barely slept. When dawn came, the city had a strange hush over it. I saw men in suits, workers in uniforms, teens with backpacks, all heading out with that same stiff, uncertain gait, because they were already wearing them. I could see the slight shimmer on their calves, the taut smoothness hugging their outlines. No one looked comfortable. No one looked happy. But no one disobeyed. I stood in front of my mirror holding the unopened packet, fingers trembling with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't anything gentle either. My reflection looked back with that stern expression I'd learned to cultivate over the years. The one that meant I was fine. Always fine. No matter what. But my eyes betrayed me. They darted toward the packet again and again. Took me an hour before I finally tore it open. The material slid out in a whisper, delicate and sheer enough that I could see the shadow of my hand through it. It felt wrong touching it, strange and intimate in a way I didn't understand. I kept thinking, this isn't mine. This doesn't belong on me. This doesn't belong to me. But the law wasn't asking me what belonged. I sat on the edge of my bed, slipped a foot inside, and felt the fabric glide upward in a single unbroken motion. It was alien and soft and confusingly pleasant in a way I didn't expect, like it was smoothing away edges I didn't realize I had. By the time both legs were encased, I could feel my pulse beating against the nylon. Standing felt strange, like I'd stepped into someone else's life. The mirror caught me before I could avoid it. I stared at the reflection, my legs looking somehow unfamiliar, more streamlined, more deliberate, almost like the hosiery had drawn invisible lines upward, changing the geometry of me in a way that didn't make sense. I felt my throat tighten. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter and infinitely heavier. Disorientation. A sense of being pulled between the man I knew myself to be and the stranger staring back at me through that thin veil of fabric. The world outside hummed with the collective discomfort of millions of men forced into the same new skin. But I felt something different buzzing under my ribs, something I didn't know how to name yet. I walked out into the morning feeling like everyone could see through me. But the truth was worse. I realized they couldn't see me at all. Not the way I wanted to be seen. Not the way I needed to be seen. Not the way the mirror had just seen me. Dimly, strangely, as if hinting at a version of myself I had never met before. That was the beginning. The beginning of confusion, yes. But also the beginning of something else quietly taking shape beneath the surface of my mind, as sheer and fragile as the fabric now hugging my skin. The next days passed in a quiet haze, as if the world were holding its breath. Every man walked with the same stiff, uncertain steps, their eyes lowered, their silhouettes subtly reshaped by the mandated hosiery that clung to them like second skin. The entire city seemed submerged in some collective dream. Strange, fragile, shimmering. At first I moved through it numb. I went to work, I came home. I pulled off the pantyhose each night like peeling away a layer of myself I wasn't ready to acknowledge. But something started happening in the small, unnoticed spaces of the day. Little glints of realization. Flickers of curiosity that I tried to ignore but couldn't. The material against my skin gradually stopped feeling foreign. Instead, it began to fade into the background, like something quietly waiting for me to understand it. One morning before leaving for work, I found myself staring at the mirror again, not out of dread this time, but because something in the reflection felt softer, firmer. My legs, shaped by the delicate lines of the fabric, didn't look wrong. They didn't look unnatural. They just looked like mine. The thought startled me so much I physically took a step back. But I didn't feel the recoil of disgust I expected. Instead, there was a strange warmth unfurling in my chest, like recognition. I left for work feeling unsettled, but not in a negative way. More like my mind was adjusting its grip on the world, loosening something I'd held too tightly for too long. The true turning point came 3 days later. It was raining that morning, a fine mist that made the air glow silver. I was walking to the plant when I saw a shop window that hadn't interested me before. A small boutique with a display of mannequins wearing hosiery in colors I'd never noticed. Deep plum, midnight blue, soft graphite. Nothing extravagant. Just subtle shifts of shade the way twilight shifts into night. I don't know what made me stop. I stood there, rain soaking through my shirt, staring at the hues as if seeing color for the first time. I knew the government only issued beige. The shade that was meant to feel neutral, bureaucratic, depersonalized. But these had personality. They had intention. They looked like choices. A flicker inside me whispered, "What would that look like on you?" I tried to silence it immediately. This wasn't the point of the mandate. We weren't meant to explore, to personalize. The directive was about unity, conformity, a flattening of expression. And yet, I found myself imagining, not just idly but vividly, what midnight blue would do to the lines of my legs. How a darker shade might shift the entire tone of my reflection. How even a subtle color might redraw the quiet edges of my silhouette. I swallowed hard, feeling my pulse rise for reasons I didn't want to name. That evening, alone in my apartment, I kept replaying the imagery in my mind. Eventually I gave in and stood in front of the mirror again. "Why am I doing this?" I whispered to my reflection, as if it could answer. But the reflection wasn't unkind. It didn't accuse. It simply looked back at me with a patience I wasn't used to giving myself. I pulled on the standard beige hosiery again, slower this time. Not out of reluctance but out of attentiveness. The glide felt smoother. Or maybe I was finally paying attention to it. The soft press of the waistband felt less intrusive, more grounding. A strange steadiness came over me, like this small ritual was teaching me to feel the shape of myself rather than hide it. And that was when something subtle changed. For the first time since the mandate, I didn't look away from the mirror immediately after dressing. I stood there longer. I studied myself, not critically, not judgmentally, but with sincere curiosity. With a question forming beneath my ribs. Who am I becoming? The reflection didn't answer. It didn't have to. The answer was in the way my breath steadied, the way my shoulders relaxed, the way the tension in my jaw loosened for the first time in years. The hosiery no longer felt like an earthly demand from a distant minister. It felt like a quiet key turning in a lock I didn't realize was inside me. The next morning, walking past the boutique again, my steps slowed without my permission. Inside, the shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with warm eyes, glanced up. Our gaze met through the glass, and for a moment she didn't look at me the way the officers did, or the way other men did, all stiff and awkward. She looked at me the way someone looks at a person who hasn't yet found their question, much less their answer. She nodded once, not beckoning, just welcoming. I didn't enter. Not that day. But something shifted the moment she nodded. A silent permission. A recognition. A tilt in the axis of my internal world. That night, I lay awake listening to the city breathe. The soft whisper of millions adjusting to the same fabric. The same rules, the same strange new life. But for the first time since the mandate, I wasn't confused. I was curious. And curiosity, I realized, was far more dangerous. And far more beautiful. It was the beginning of discovery. Quiet, subtle, unspoken, but real. Real enough that I knew, even without admitting it aloud, that my reflection would not remain the same for long. Not now that I had finally dared to look at it. Not now that it had begun looking back. The conflict didn't arrive as a single moment. It wasn't an explosion or a confrontation or a sudden crisis. It came quietly, like a slow tightening in the chest, a pressure I didn't realize had been building until it felt too heavy to ignore. It began the morning I finally stepped into the boutique. I don't know what pushed me through the door. Maybe the nod the shopkeeper had given me days earlier, maybe the persistent curiosity that had settled like a small flame behind my ribs. Maybe it was simply that the beige hosiery issued by the government felt increasingly insufficient, like a blurred outline of a portrait I was slowly learning to see. Inside, the shop was warm and softly lit. Rows of hosiery lined the walls in muted colors that seemed to hum gently under the lights. The shopkeeper looked up from her counter and smiled. A small smile, but genuine. "I was wondering when you'd come in," she said. I froze, caught between embarrassment and an aching sense of relief. "I was just looking," I managed to say, but the words sounded thin, unconvincing even to myself. "That's what most people say before they start seeing themselves," she answered calmly. Her words struck something inside me, something tender and unsteady. I should have left right then. I should have turned around and retreated back into the familiar discomfort of denial. Instead, I stood there, unable to move, as she approached with slow, careful steps. "Color changes the way we perceive ourselves," she said, gesturing to the shelves. "Sometimes it reveals things we weren't ready to admit we were missing." I swallowed hard. My hands trembled slightly. "I don't want anything complicated," I said. "Just curious." "Curiosity is never simple," she replied with a gentle tilt of her head. "But it's honest." She handed me a pair in a soft graphite shade. Something subtle, darker than the government beige, but not bold enough to declare anything out loud. Something that whispered instead of shouted. I paid for it quickly, almost guiltily, and rushed home with the bag hidden inside my jacket. That night, I stared at the graphite pair for nearly an hour. The room felt too quiet, too watchful. My reflection hovered in the mirror, waiting for me to choose. A voice inside me whispered, "If you put them on, something will change. And you can't undo it." Another voice whispered back, "Maybe that's the point." The conflict between these thoughts twisted in my chest, tight and relentless. I slipped the hosiery on. The sensation was the same glide as always, but the color made everything feel different. My legs looked deliberate, not accidental, not forced, as if the reflection wasn't an imposition but an interpretation I had chosen. But choice was dangerous. The moment I realized I liked what I saw, truly liked it, something inside me buckled with fear. I backed away from the mirror. Hard. My breath came fast and uneven. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "This isn't who I am. This isn't." But the reflection didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. It looked at me steadily, and the steadiness made something inside me snap. I tore the hosiery off, folded it too neatly, shoved it back into the drawer as if hiding it would bury the truth along with it. 4 days after, I tried to force myself back into the rhythm of before. Work, bath, compliance, nothing more. But the graphite pair sat in my drawer like a heartbeat I could hear even through wood. And every time I pulled on the government-issued beige, a small ache flared under my ribs, a longing I didn't dare name. The conflict grew louder. At work, the silence between the men became suffocating. No one talked about the mandate, but everyone lived inside its shadow. Some wore the pantyhose like prison chains. Some pretended not to notice them at all. And some, though they would never admit it, glanced at their own reflections with something complex flickering behind their eyes. I began catching myself doing the same. One morning, in the reflection of the metal elevator doors, I saw the shape of my legs in the beige hosiery and felt a strange pang, not because it looked wrong, but because it didn't look complete. Like the color was muting something I was finally learning to hear. I slammed the feeling down hard. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was confusing external change with internal desire. But repression doesn't erase truth. It only sharpens it. The breaking point came on a Friday night. I had just returned from work, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor I did all day. The apartment felt hollow, the silence pressing against me from all sides. Open the drawer. The graphite pear lay there untouched, soft, shimmering faintly like a secret waiting to be claimed. My mind fought violently. My body ached with longing. My reflection watched me from across the room, patient and unforgiving. Finally, with hands shaking, I put them on again. This time I didn't look away from the mirror. I stood there breathing hard, heart racing, but I didn't run. I didn't tear them off. I didn't try to reason with myself or justify anything. I simply looked. And my reflection, wrapped in that soft, subtle darkness, looked back with a clarity that felt both terrifying and tender. The conflict didn't resolve in that moment. Deepened. Because I knew then, beyond all denial, that the battle wasn't between me and the hosiery. It wasn't about compliance or politics or mandated uniforms. The battle was between me and the version of myself I had never allowed to exist. The version trying, quietly, bravely, to be seen. Transformation didn't come with trumpets or revelations. It came the way dawn slips over rooftops. Slow, quiet, inevitable. It came in the moments between denial and acceptance, in the small choices that accumulated like dew on a window. The night I stood in the graphite hosiery and saw myself clearly, I thought the conflict would swallow me whole. Instead, it softened, as if my reflection had exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. But clarity is not the same as peace. The next morning, I woke with a strange calmness humming through me, as though some internal knot had loosened in the night. I dressed in the mandated beige for work, but the beige felt different now. Not oppressive, not bland, just incomplete. All day, I moved through the plant with an unusual steadiness. No frantic denial, no spiraling guilt. Just a quiet awareness humming under my skin. Every time the beige fabric brushed against my legs, it whispered a simple truth. There is more to you than this. That evening, I didn't hesitate when I reached the drawer. The graphite pear slid onto my skin like a memory I hadn't lived yet. Familiar, comforting, expansive. My reflection didn't shock me this time. Instead, it welcomed me with something like recognition. I stared at myself for a long time, not searching for flaws or contradictions, but listening, waiting. And slowly, as if rising from somewhere deep within, a thought formed. I am not becoming someone else. I am becoming more myself. Over the next week, the transformation unfolded quietly. I started alternating between the beige and graphite at home, not to hide but to explore. Some nights the beige felt grounding, a reminder of the world outside. Other nights the graphite felt like a doorway into a softer, quieter place inside me, one I'd always kept locked. I found myself lingering in the mirror longer. Not out of vanity but curiosity. I studied the shape of my silhouette, the way the different shades changed the mood of my reflection, the way the smoothness of the fabric made me stand with a different posture, straighter, more deliberate, more aware. Each night, the mirror felt less like a judge and more like a companion. One evening, almost without thinking, I walked back to the boutique. The shopkeeper greeted me with the same gentle smile, as though she had been expecting me again. "You seem lighter," she said simply. "I don't know what I seem," I replied. But the words weren't defensive, they were honest. She guided me toward a display at the back. Colors slightly richer, textures slightly more refined. Nothing flamboyant, just expressive. Intentional. I reached for a pair in a muted plum shade. The color looked warm, grounding, strangely familiar. The shopkeeper nodded. "That one will teach you something." Her phrasing should have confused me. Instead, it made sense in a way I couldn't explain. When I got home and slipped into the plum pear, something inside me shifted again. Subtle but unmistakable. The hue added a warmth to my reflection that beige and graphite never had. My legs looked not just shaped but held, supported. I approached the mirror slowly, breath catching. And there I was. Not the man defined by habit, not the one shaped by expectation or uniformity, but the quieter version of myself, the one I'd kept tucked behind rigidity and denial, the one who wanted gentleness, expression, softness, not as an erasure of masculinity, but as an expansion of it. For the first time I whispered to my reflection, "I think I know you." And the reflection seemed to soften in response. Transformation gathered momentum after that. Not outwardly. No one at work noticed anything different. The world still moved in mandated beige. Checkpoints still enforced compliance. Men still walked with the strange blend of discomfort and resignation. But inside me everything was shifting. Every night I explored new shades, new textures, new sensations of self. And with each pair I tried, plum, smoke gray, dusk brown, even a soft ocean blue I never expected to like, I shed a layer of fear. Transformation wasn't about looking feminine or masculine. It wasn't about rebellion or compliance. It wasn't about fulfilling expectations or defying them. It was about resonance. About recognizing which version of myself felt truthful. One night, as I stood in a deep charcoal pear that made my silhouette feel grounded and confident, I realized something startling. I was no longer afraid of my reflection. The man in the mirror wasn't an enemy to battle or a stranger to fear. He was someone in transition, not between genders or identities, but between layers of himself. Transformation was not a destination. It was a deepening, a widening, a softening of edges I had sharpened out of habit. And as I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, fingertips brushing the cool glass, I realized something even deeper. The person looking back was finally meeting me halfway. Harmony arrived quietly, the way rain softens the edges of a night. So gradually you don't notice until everything feels washed clean. There was no single awakening, no dramatic internal victory. Instead, there was a slow settling, a gentle alignment between the self I had feared and the self I had finally allowed to breathe. The world outside didn't change. The mandate remained. Men still walked in their government-issued beige hosiery, some resentful, some resigned, some pretending the feeling of smooth fabric against their legs meant nothing. The checkpoints stood on every corner. The broadcasts kept repeating familiar phrases about unity and health and social alignment. But I had changed. On a quiet morning weeks after my journey began, I woke with sunlight spilling across my room like a quiet invitation. I sat at the edge of my bed with a drawer open, looking down at the collection I had gathered without fully realizing it. Graphite, plum, charcoal, dusk brown, ocean blue, and the soft standard beige that had once felt like a stranger's command but now felt like part of my story. For the first time, I didn't reach automatically for any particular shade. I simply listened. Not with my ears, but with that deeper part of me that had spent so long muffled, ignored, misunderstood. The part of me that finally trusted me to listen. My hand moved toward the graphite pear. Not because it was bold, not because it made me feel different, but because it felt like home. Quiet. Grounded. Clear. When I slipped it on, there was no rush of transformation, no shock, no emotional upheaval. Simply felt right. Like breath. Like something that had always belonged to me, waiting for the day I was ready to acknowledge it. I stood in front of the mirror expecting to analyze myself again, to search for meaning, for signs, for some answer that would explain my journey. But instead I simply stood there and was. My reflection no longer questioned me. It no longer challenged or confused or frightened me. It felt like an old friend who had waited patiently for me to understand them. Work felt different that day too. The men around me seemed as lost as ever, but I no longer mirrored their confusion. There was no shame in the glide of the fabric, no tension in the way it shaped my legs. Every step felt honest. At lunch, I caught my reflection in the darkened window by the cafeteria door. For the first time I smiled at it, not because of how I looked but because it felt like we were finally on the same side. That evening, when I returned to the boutique, the shopkeeper didn't greet me with surprise. She simply nodded, as if sensing the gentleness in my posture, the way my shoulders no longer curled inward. "You've arrived," she said. "Where?" asked, genuinely curious. "In yourself," she replied. "Which is where all journeys end, if you walk them long enough." I didn't need more colors. I didn't need more explanations. Instead, I spent time listening to her speak about materials, shades, the way clothing shifts how we move through the world. But her words weren't really about fabric. They were about identity, flexible, adaptive, expressive. Before I left, she placed a folded pair in my hand. A neutral shade that hovered between gray and violet, subtle enough to pass as ordinary unless seen in the right light. "This is balance," she said. "For the days when you want to carry every version of yourself together." When I wore it the next morning, something clicked into place. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet alignment, an internal and external softening that made sense of all the confusion, all the conflict, all the discovery that had shaped me. In that moment, I realized harmony was not about choosing one identity over another. It wasn't about becoming feminine or masculine, compliant or rebellious, hidden or expressive. It was about holding the entirety of who I was with a steadiness that did not waver. Walking through the city, past men still trapped in discomfort, past officers enforcing rules neither of us had created, I felt something deeper than acceptance. I felt anchored, not to the mandate, not to the hosiery, but to myself. Weeks later, the transformation continued quietly, naturally. Not in my wardrobe, though colors gradually became a part of my private rituals, but in my posture, my voice, my breath. Conversations at work felt easier. My reflection no longer loomed like a verdict. And the small acts of gentleness I showed myself in private began to ripple into the world around me. I caught moments of recognition in other men's eyes. Small flickers of longing, curiosity, fear, hope. Maybe their journeys hadn't begun yet. Maybe they never would. But I no longer felt isolated inside my experience. I had learned something essential. Harmony isn't granted. It's cultivated, nurtured, built from the slow unraveling of fear and the tender weaving of truth. One night, standing alone in my apartment with the city lights flickering through the window, I caught my reflection again. The graphite hosiery wrapped my legs in quiet shadow. My silhouette stood tall, neither masculine nor feminine, simply mine. Entirely, unapologetically, softly mine. I stepped closer to the mirror. "I see you," I whispered. And for the first time, the reflection didn't seem separate. It didn't feel like an image on glass. It felt like me, whole, integrated, unbroken. Harmony wasn't a conclusion. It wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of living without fear of myself. And as I turned away from the mirror, the world felt a little lighter, a little clearer. Held gently, like the soft glide of fabric that had started as a mandate but had become something much more. Language. A companion. Truth. Way home.